The sun hung low in the sky, a bleeding orange, casting long shadows across the barren land. The wind carried the dust of years gone by, relentless and silent. In the distance, the dry grass trembled beneath its touch, as if whispering secrets only the earth knew. A lone rider emerged from the horizon, silhouetted against the fading light. Dust clung to his worn boots, and his saddle creaked with each heavy step, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breath. His name was Thomas Caldwell, a man who had seen more than his fair share of loss. The town of Cactus Creek had never seen much of anything but cattle, drought, and hard men. But today, something had shifted. Something unseen, but very real. Word had spread fast, like wildfire catching dry brush. There was a woman at the center of it all, a woman wronged by the hands of men, shunned and abused by the town she once called home. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. Her crime? A whisper in the night, a lie that was never hers to tell, but was forced upon her, accused of witchcraft, of betrayal, but no one ever questioned the truth. They were too eager to hang her, to tear her down, to erase her from the earth. The church had already proclaimed her guilty, and the rest of the town had followed, their eyes blind to the truth. As the sun dipped lower, Thomas Caldwell's horse clopped slowly along the dusty road toward the town. His worn hat tilted forward, shadowing his tired eyes. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And today, it had found him again. The town square was eerily quiet, save for the murmurs of a small crowd gathered around the scaffold. A noose hung from the post, swaying gently in the breeze. Thomas could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their judgment. But he didn't care. Not today. Today, he had come for Evelyn Mercer, and nothing else mattered. As he rode closer, he saw her standing at the center of the square, her head bowed, her hands bound tightly to the post. The sun's light caught her hair, now wild and tangled, but still golden in its own way. She looked so small there, so fragile, as if the weight of the world had pressed her down into the earth. Her face was bruised, but it didn't hide the fire in her eyes, the fire that had once burned so bright. "Don't touch it, please," she cried, her voice hoarse, as she struggled against her restraints. Thomas didn't need to hear more. The rope that bound her wrists was a symbol of the injustice she had been forced to endure, a symbol of everything wrong in this God-forsaken town. The crowd was hushed, their eyes following his every movement. But Thomas knew better than to look at them. His gaze was fixed on Evelyn. Slowly, he dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, barely heard over the beating of his own heart. "I promised it wouldn't hurt," he whispered under his breath, though the words were meant more for himself than for anyone else. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the rope. The crowd held their breath. Evelyn's eyes flicked up to meet his, wide with both fear and something else, something Thomas couldn't quite place. "Go ahead, if you're brave enough." The rancher's heart skipped. What was she asking of him? Was it a dare? Was she testing him as if she knew something he didn't? He steadied his hand, careful not to make a sound, as he touched the rope. The moment his fingers brushed against it, something deep inside him stirred. A memory, a feeling, a silent promise. The wind kicked up, lifting her hair and tossing it in the air like some wild thing that refused to be contained. He moved closer, the distance between them closing with every step. The crowd watched, but they weren't the ones who mattered now. Evelyn's breath caught, and her voice faltered again. "Please, don't—" But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He stepped forward, his hands sure, determined, as he began to slowly untie the knot. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a flicker of something alive stir within him, something he thought he had lost in the years following his wife's death. It was a sense of purpose, a quiet promise that he had made to himself long ago, but had long since forgotten. The knot came undone with a soft pull. The rope fell to the ground. The sound of the rope hitting the dusty earth was like the final crack of thunder before the storm. The crowd remained still, not daring to move, as if caught in the very breath of a moment that could not be undone. Thomas stepped back, his hands trembling only slightly as he met Evelyn's gaze. The woman was silent now, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life, as if the weight of the town's judgment had crushed every word from her tongue until nothing remained but the coldness of fear and defiance. "Go ahead." Evelyn's voice was steady now, but there was a tremor beneath the words. Her eyes, dark and haunted, never left his face. "Take it off slowly." Thomas paused. His hand hovered above the thick, worn fabric of her dress, the fabric that had become both armor and prison. For the first time, he noticed the fine tremor in her chest, the slight rise and fall of her breath. Her shoulders were tense, as if she was bracing for the worst. And in that moment, Thomas realized something. Evelyn was not the woman the town had painted her to be. She wasn't a witch, a traitor, or an outcast. She was just a woman, like any other, forced into a life of survival by a world too harsh for the tender-hearted. Without a word, he lifted the hem of her dress slowly. The soft fabric crinkled beneath his touch. The heat of the sun burned down on them both, but all Thomas could feel was the coldness of the town's stares, the weight of their eyes. Evelyn flinched, but she didn't look away. Her face was pale, the shadows under her eyes deep, but there was something fierce in the way she stood. She had been broken, yes, but not defeated. Thomas's breath caught in his throat when he saw what lay beneath the fabric. A brand, a deep, searing scar, a mark that had been burned into her skin like a cattle brand, the letter W still faintly visible. The shame of her punishment, the symbol of her crime. The town had marked her as guilty, not just with words, but with fire. They had made sure she would never escape their judgment. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let them see it. Don't let them know." But it was too late. The crowd had already seen. They had already formed their judgments. They had already condemned her, and no amount of hiding would ever take that away. Thomas's heart clenched. The pain in her voice was enough to break a man, to tear him apart from the inside. The brand was nothing but a symbol, but to her it was everything. It was the mark of her punishment, the burden she had carried for years, the scar that would never fade. He had seen many things in his life: blood, death, war, loss. But this was different. This was a quiet, unspoken suffering, the kind that went unnoticed by most, but left deep wounds on the soul. He stepped back, his fingers brushing against his worn cowboy hat, a silent gesture of respect. He had come here to save her, but in this moment he realized that she didn't need saving. She needed someone to see her, to understand the weight she carried. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them like water in a stream. A child's voice, clear and small, broke through the noise. She didn't do it. She didn't deserve this. For a moment, everything stopped. The air hung heavy with the weight of the child's words. The murmurs quieted. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of this tiny crack in their collective indifference. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the child, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was the first time Thomas had seen her smile, and it made his chest tighten. It wasn't a smile of joy, but a smile of something else, something that could only be understood by those who had lived through the worst of it. Thomas glanced at the child. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin tilted slightly upward as she stared at the townspeople, her small face fierce with a quiet anger. The child's voice had made a ripple, and for the first time, the silence of the crowd wasn't oppressive. It was a moment of uncertainty, of a town realizing that perhaps their judgment had been too hasty. But Thomas knew it wasn't enough. The town's judgment would never be changed by a child's words. The adults, the ones who held the power, were too far gone in their beliefs. But that didn't matter now. "Take it off slowly," Evelyn repeated, her voice low, as if she was speaking to herself more than anyone else. Thomas's hands moved to her dress again, but this time with a tenderness that surprised him. He pulled it away gently, revealing the full extent of the brand. The scar, deep and jagged, was still raw, as if it had been burned into her flesh only days ago. The wind blew softly, a quiet reminder that time was moving on, that life was moving on. The town's silence hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud that had yet to burst. The eyes of the crowd, once full of certainty and malice, now shifted uneasily, caught between their whispered judgment and the growing crack in their collective consciousness. Evelyn stood motionless, the brand on her skin a silent scream of a past they had all but forgotten. Her arms hung limply at her sides, as though the weight of the world had pressed down on her so hard that even the smallest movement felt like it would break her. Thomas looked at the scar once more, his fingers hovering just above it, as if not daring to touch the mark of her shame. He felt a deep, gnawing sorrow in his chest, a sorrow for Evelyn, for the way the world had turned its back on her. His gaze shifted to the townspeople. Their faces were drawn tight, their expressions a mixture of guilt, shame, and confusion. But there was no turning back now. "She didn't deserve this." The child's voice broke the silence again, louder this time. Her small feet shuffled in the dirt, her hands balled into tiny fists at her sides. "She never did nothing wrong." Thomas looked down at the girl. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't shaking. Her words were as simple as they were true, as pure as the dust that clung to the soles of their boots. But in the world of Cactus Creek, simple truths had a way of getting buried beneath the weight of lies. A man in the crowd shifted uneasily, his voice like gravel grinding in the dust. "You're telling us this woman's innocent?" His words were sharp, meant to cut. "She's nothing but trouble." The words stung, but Thomas remained still, his eyes locked on the townspeople, daring them to make the next move. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had long since stopped flinching. She had been condemned by them long before this moment. She knew they would never see her as anything more than the monster they had painted her to be. But it wasn't the crowd that mattered now. It was Evelyn. "Take it off slowly." Evelyn's voice was steady now, but it wasn't a command. It was a plea, a quiet, whispered cry for a world that might never come. Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the edge of her dress again, his fingers brushing against the rough, sun-baked fabric. He couldn't imagine the pain it must have caused her to have lived in the shadow of this brand for so long, to have carried it with her like a second skin, a constant reminder of her shame, her guilt, her betrayal. But the truth, the one thing they all had ignored, was that the guilt wasn't hers. It never had been. The town had condemned her based on whispers and half-truths. They had never once stopped to ask her why she was accused, why she had been cast aside like a broken thing waiting for someone to come along and claim her pieces. But no one had. No one but Thomas. His hands pulled the dress away slowly, almost reverently, as if he were undoing something that had been done wrong. The crowd watched in silence, their breath held as he uncovered what had been hidden for so long. The scar was now fully visible, a dark, raw reminder of a history they were unwilling to face. Thomas's fingers grazed the brand once more, not in pity, but in understanding. This was the mark of survival, not guilt. Evelyn had lived with this, had endured it, but she had not broken. The brand, though it marked her, would not define her. "You promised it wouldn't hurt," Evelyn whispered again, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. She was asking something more now, asking for something no one had ever given her. Thomas nodded, the gesture small but resolute. "I promised." And then, with a single motion, he pulled the hem of her dress away completely, the fabric falling to the ground like the final shroud that had hidden her truth. The crowd gasped, but there was no turning back, no hiding what had been done. The scar was raw, still freshly red beneath the fading tan of her skin, and in the center of it, the faint outline of the letter W stood bold and defiant, just as Evelyn had been. Thomas didn't look at the crowd. He didn't care what they thought. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Evelyn, on the woman who had been cast aside and forgotten by the world, on the woman who had endured more pain than any one person should ever have to bear. In that moment, he made a promise to himself, a promise to her. No one would ever make her feel small again. No one would ever look at her the way the town had. But there was still one thing left to do. "Go ahead, if you're brave enough." Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion now, her eyes clouded with unshed tears, but there was no fear in her gaze. It was the challenge, the final test. She had survived so much already. What was one more push? Thomas took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The crowd was still, their breath held, waiting for him to act. But there was something in Evelyn's eyes, something that told him the truth had already been spoken. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, and in it, Thomas made a choice. He wasn't here for the town. He wasn't here for their approval or their judgment. He was here for Evelyn. And he was going to see this through, no matter the cost. He reached down, grabbing the piece of rope that had been left behind when he had untied her, the rope that had bound her to this moment for far too long. The wind had picked up, tugging at the edges of Evelyn's dress, sending dust swirling in the air like ghosts from forgotten pasts. The sun was slipping further behind the hills, its dying light casting long shadows across the town. Thomas stood with the rope in his hands, the weight of it almost too much to bear. It wasn't just the rope that burdened him. it was the history of it. The rope was a symbol of everything that had happened here, everything the town had done to her, everything they had done to him. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what was coming next. The man who had come to her rescue had the rope in his hands, but it wasn't to hang her. No, he had come to break the chains. He had come to burn away the lies that had built this town up like a fortress of falsehoods. Evelyn stood there, her face now streaked with tears, her body still and defiant in the light of the sinking sun. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for the world that had never seen her, not the woman she was, but the one they had made her into. She cried for the childhood dreams stolen by injustice, for the years wasted under the weight of a truth no one would listen to. "Thomas!" Her voice was soft, but firm, like the breaking of a dam. "Don't do this for me." Thomas didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the rope, his fingers threading through the fibers with practiced precision. It was a familiar task, one he had done 1,000 times over in his life. But this time, it was different. This time, the rope wasn't for tying down cattle or hanging a man. It was for freedom, for breaking the chains that had bound them both. "I ain't doing it for you," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to her. "I'm doing it for the both of us." For the first time, Evelyn looked at him with something other than despair in her eyes. There was a quiet kind of wonder in the way she looked at him, a softness that he hadn't expected. Maybe she had hoped that someone, anyone, would see her for who she truly was, not just the label they had slapped on her. He finished with the knot, the final tie tight and solid. But it wasn't a noose. No, this knot would be the first step in undoing what had been done to her. "I won't let them win," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not like this." Evelyn didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her expression was enough. It was the silent defiance of a woman who had been told she was nothing, only to stand before them and say, "I am more than you could ever understand." The crowd's murmurs swelled, a sea of judgment slowly ebbing away. It wasn't a tidal wave of change, more like a gentle ripple, but a ripple nonetheless. People were starting to look at Evelyn differently, starting to see her for who she was, not just what she had been accused of. The man who had stepped forward was no hero. He was a man who had been broken by his own losses, by the wars he had fought, and the wife he had buried years ago. But in this moment, in this space, he had become more than just a protector. He had become the symbol of what could be, but it wasn't without cost. As the rope fell to the ground, Evelyn stepped forward, her feet dragging in the dust. She took a shaky breath, wiping away a tear that had begun to fall freely down her cheek. She had seen enough loss, enough pain, to fill 1,000 lifetimes. But here, now, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't joy, it wasn't triumph, but it was something, a flicker of life, that had nearly been smothered under the weight of years. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply reached into his jacket, pulling out a small silver knife, a relic from a past that he had long since buried. His fingers gripped the handle tightly, but it wasn't for cutting the rope or for any act of violence. It was for something else. Slowly, Thomas walked up to Evelyn, his steps measured. The townsfolk parted as he approached, their faces pale with unease. There was fear in their eyes, fear of the unknown, fear of what was coming next. But Thomas didn't care. He had lived with fear long enough. He stopped in front of her, the knife resting in his hand, its cool steel gleaming in the fading sunlight. "Take it off, Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet but firm. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. The wound on her skin was a scar that had shaped her, defined her in ways she couldn't explain. It was the mark that they had placed on her, the mark they had used to tear her down. And now, with the man who had come to rescue her standing before her, that mark was all but ready to be erased. Evelyn's breath hitched, her chest tight with a storm of emotions, but she nodded. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached down to the hem of her dress and began to pull it away. The fabric moved easily, as if the very cloth was ready to let go of the past. As the last fold of her dress fell away, her skin was revealed once more, the scar now visible in the cold light of the day. The crowd held its breath. But this time, the scar wasn't just a symbol of guilt. This time, it was a symbol of survival. Thomas lifted the knife. The town of Cactus Creek had seen many things, but nothing like this. The sun, now sinking below the horizon, cast a muted orange glow over the square, as though the land itself was watching in hushed awe. Evelyn stood there, her dress pooled at her feet like a discarded memory, the mark of her shame, the brand still visible on her skin. But she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Thomas stood before her, the silver knife gripped tightly in his hand. He had been a man broken by life's cruelties, a man who had lost the will to care for much. But in this moment, the blade was not for destruction. It was for redemption. The crowd had fallen completely silent, the weight of their collective guilt pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Not a single word was spoken. No judgment was passed. Even the child, whose voice had first cracked the silence, stood frozen in the dust, watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Thomas looked at Evelyn one last time before he made the first incision. The air felt thick with the weight of the past, of the years they had both spent in the shadows of the world's cruelty. He had come here today to right a wrong, not for glory, not for fame, but for Evelyn, and for himself. The knife's edge touched her skin. Evelyn didn't even flinch. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her breathing steady despite the weight of the moment. The brand, the mark of her supposed guilt, would be undone. But it wouldn't be a clean, swift process. No, this was going to be slow, painful, but necessary. Every slice, every turn of the blade was one step closer to freedom. Thomas worked with careful precision, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that rushed through him. The crowd's eyes remained fixed on the two of them, but no one spoke. The air was thick with a quiet that screamed louder than any words could. Evelyn's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but she didn't make a sound. Her body, so long a prisoner to the mark of shame, was now in the process of reclaiming itself. The pain was real, but it was a small price to pay. After all, what was the cost of survival? What was the cost of reclaiming your own truth? As the last piece of skin was cut away, Thomas stepped back, the knife lowered to his side. The scar was still there. The wound that had shaped Evelyn had defined her life for so long. But now there was something else, something new, a fresh start, a chance to rewrite her story. Evelyn blinked away the tears that had gathered at the corners of her eyes. She had endured so much, so many years of pain, of being cast aside, of being seen as nothing more than the sum of her mistakes. But now she was something else. She was free. The silence in the square hung heavy for just a moment longer, and then, as if on cue, a single voice broke through. It was the child again, her voice small but strong. "She's free," the girl said, her words simple, but filled with undeniable truth. "She's free." The words reverberated through the crowd, echoing in the stillness. For the first time, the people of Cactus Creek looked at Evelyn not with judgment, not with scorn, but with something new. They looked at her with something that felt like understanding, or at least the beginning of it. Thomas stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. His heart was still pounding, but there was a lightness to him now, a weight lifted that he didn't even realize he had been carrying. He hadn't just cut away Evelyn's mark. He had cut away a part of himself, too. He had given her the chance for something different, something better, something more. Evelyn looked up at him then, her gaze no longer filled with the resignation of a woman who had been cast aside. There was something else there now, something that had been buried deep within her, waiting to be set free. Gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of something more. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice quieter this time, but no less powerful. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words had already been spoken, not in grand gestures, but in simple, quiet acts of survival. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their feet dragging in the dust as they left the square. Some walked away in silence, their heads bowed in shame, while others exchanged glances that spoke volumes. There was no grand gesture of forgiveness, no applause, just a quiet, slow reckoning with the truth they had tried so hard to avoid. And then, as the last of the crowd disappeared into the twilight, Thomas and Evelyn were left alone in the square. The wind had picked up again, but this time it didn't feel like a storm. It was just the wind, the same wind that had carried their stories for so long, the same wind that now whispered of a new beginning. Evelyn slowly bent down to pick up her discarded dress, but Thomas stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't need it," he said softly. "Not anymore." Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes shining with a quiet kind of strength. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. It wasn't a grand, dramatic smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of survival, of knowing that, no matter what the world had tried to do to her, she had endured. And now she was free. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. As the night settled around them, the stars blinking softly above, they walked away from the square together. No longer bound by the past, no longer defined by the lies. Just two people, free at last. Subscribe for more heart-wrenching Wild West tales, deep emotional stories, and unforgettable characters. Don't miss the adventure.